Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. Tonight we continue our series of interviews with prominent freedom fighters. And tonight, once again, I'm very happy to welcome to our show Major Stephen Coughlin, a fellow with the Center for Security Policy, a senior fellow, and a former military expert on Islamic law who has gained considerable respect in the United States and worldwide for his incisive and perceptive analyses of Islamic law and the aspirations of Islamic supremacists in the United States and around the world. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, Robert. Glad to be here.
And tonight we are going to be speaking about the coin doctrine. And so could you tell us in first place what exactly that is?
Well, the coin doctrine is a shortened term for counterinsurgency doctrine. And of course, those doctrines go all the way back to the Romans, and they're most classically understood in the United States going back to the turn of the last century when the Marine Corps wrote a very good counterinsurgency manual when they were in Latin America all the time. But I think most people are familiar with it today as it's been brought forward by the United States fighting in Iraq and now Afghanistan. And so speaking about the coin in that instance, I'm referring to that.
So the counterinsurgency doctrine is essentially the American government strategy for dealing with the Islamic Jihad threat in its totality. Would that be a correct summation?
I think it'd be better to say it's how they have decided to fight and engage on the ground, first in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. And what I do is I look at it in terms of what a coin strategy is supposed to be and really what this has turned out to be. And there's two kind of influencers that I focus on. There are many people could focus on. One is, historically, when you talk about hearts and minds, you mean go in, talk to the people, find out what really drives them, what are the real threats, and then formulate how you're going to respond, both with carrots and sticks, based on that reality. But that's not what we have in this war, because what has happened is we have made a decision. We cannot understand what President Obama called the one driving principle in that part of the world when he said in a speech back in September 2012 that Islam is the one guiding principle.
And that's what they're not allowed to talk about in the Obama administration.
Yes.
They're not allowed to discuss that as the guiding principle. And so they really have a strategy that's no strategy at all because it ignores the elephant in the room that's the genuine driving force behind the counterinsurgency they're trying to combat.
Well, exactly. And more importantly, even if there were, well, let me rephrase that. Given that there are people in that part of the world, it's the Islamic world, so everybody there is going to be Muslim, or at least a high percentage of the main players, that you have to account not just for how the Taliban will perceive Islam, or how but also how the government perceives Islam. And that will be based not just on how they conduct themselves, but what they're legally held to. And that's where I come to it. You're right. If we cannot talk about the one guiding principle of that part of the country, we were responsible for writing the Constitution of Afghanistan. And the Afghan Constitution names the government of Afghanistan as the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And the Constitution says it's governed by Islamic law. So we're not even talking about the Taliban yet. And what I'm pointing out here is if you are going to do a hearts and mind campaign in Afghanistan and not leave out completely all considerations having to do with that aspect of the country, how do you get to the hearts and minds, both to positively influence those in the community who would not want to be jihadis or oriented toward jihad, and those who are oriented and how you can walk them back? So what do we have for hearts and minds? Well, it's very reminiscent of Vietnam. What is it? What is it? If you build 3 houses, 1 school, and a Coca-Cola plant, and 1 mile of road, you have 3.4 increments of goodwill. And we need to have 17.2 increments of goodwill to get this population, town, village, to like us this much, and our success is to have 40 increments of goodwill. Now, I'm saying that facetiously, but what I'm saying is the entire response to goodwill is drinking 3 cups of tea with tribal chiefs and these completely material responses to a completely non-material a reality, the declared jihad that started our entry into Afghanistan and still dominates it. So taking one step back from the Coin doctrine is premised on having some situational awareness of the population you're in. And if you take away the core aspect of the population of Afghanistan, the fact that it's Islamic and this is what is causing us to be in these wars, then you have no capacity to do hearts and minds. And so that's what I'm getting at. But
Okay,
there's
that's
another.
what is really the key point here. And so, can we elaborate on that a little bit? Can you explain to us why it is that if the United States government goes into Afghanistan and they build 3 schools and 3 hospitals and 1 highway and so on, well, why don't they get those percentage increments of goodwill? What goes wrong? Why is it different from Vietnam?
Well, I think that it's not different in that respect. I think that there's no attempt to actually know who the population is.
Yes.
I, I think it's a Western statist mindset.
And also, it's trying to buy friendships and buy goodwill,
Try
which
by friendship
never
and
works on a personal level. Why should it work on an international one?
well, I think that the joke has been the Afghans have made it very clear they can be rented, but they can't be owned. And I think they're perfectly willing to drain our banks for their infrastructure until things get to a point where they just don't need us anymore. And I think that's the issue I get to, because if you take one step, going back to coin is about you winning a war through mapping the outcomes to the things that you need to do and the objections you have to reach based on your capabilities. But this coin is based on the fact that we turned over a lot of our what were we saying in the coin in Afghanistan? That success in the war comes from the fact that the Afghan people will have confidence in the Afghan government. Well, actually, there's not too much that our troops and our presence there can do to influence that. I mean, that's not something that's in our, it's not something we can control. But more importantly, we did this as partners with the Karzai government. Well, he came up with this, what, 10 or 12 rules for rules of engagement. And those rules of engagement were basically from the head of a state of a country that's a declared Islamic republic. So my point is, if it's an Islamic republic and their constitution says it's beholden to Islamic law, and it is an Islamic republic, and we wrote the constitution that said it's beholden to Islamic law, we should actually expect to see the failed coin policy we're seeing right now. Or put differently, it's pretty much doing what you would expect it to do if our coin strategy was mapped toward what Islamic law allows us to do in terms of our success.
Yeah, we might have expected it if we had any kind of reasonable and accurate analysis of Islam in Washington. But
Sure.
given the fact that we do not have that it's been officially forbidden at the highest levels, it's no wonder that the Obama administration is continuing to sign on to these self-defeating rules of engagement. And would you say that the Karzai government has made an adequate response to all the green on blue attacks in Afghanistan?
Well, there you have it. I mean, this is the thing I try to walk back on, and I don't want to get too finger in the chest with people. I actually think these senior people don't understand this. But what is our response to the green on blue attacks? That our people are responsible for themselves being murdered. Well, you know, that is completely contrary to anything you've ever heard from rules of war. Here it is, you're telling your officers to, you know, take off your gear and work side by side with people who then turn around and kill you. And then we come up with, have you ever noticed the reporting? They were in an Afghan uniform of some sort. The
Oh, yeah.
implication being that the Taliban snuck onto a base and they snuck into a uniform and killed these people. Well, that may have happened on some of these occasions. Actually, I'm not sure it happened at all on these occasions. These people did what they were supposed to do, if Islamic law is what drives the law in Afghanistan. And so here it is. It would never be the fault of a Muslim declaring jihad against a non-Muslim force in Islamic lands, right? To
Of
go
course.
strike out against them. So of course it would always be our fault.
Always. It always is.
Under a coin strategy that ultimately rests in the hands of Karzai, who is governed according to Islamic law. Does not Islamic law say, and has not the OIC validated, that when non-Muslim forces enter Muslim lands, they are supposed to fight them by every means possible? It says that. And I think it was 2003 or 2004, the OIC said that. And so, what we're seeing is, I think, kind of what's weird isn't what Karzai is doing. What's weird is our response to it. And of course, what makes this response possible is this enforced state of ignorance, where we're saying that Islamic law has nothing to do with what's going on there, so you shouldn't really take a look at it, despite the fact that we had a hand in creating the Constitution of Iraq that names the country the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and says that the Constitution is completely subordinated to Islamic law. So what you have is a situation here where the coin strategy, or where the facts that are driving this issue, are really pounding people in the face. I mean, it's like you have to have thick enough to be a hockey goalie's mask to not get hit in the face with this. And yet the level of denial just keeps coming and coming and coming. And so it's not neutral. It's getting our troops killed and getting our senior leaders to blame our soldiers for their own murder.
Well, what do you think this is coming from? Why is there all this willful blindness and denial? Have suddenly anybody with a modicum of intelligence, have they suddenly all left the military? Or is there a genuine strategy or genuine goal that's being pursued, however wrongheaded it may be?
Well, I think that there have been points in this war where we've had strategies that were wrongheaded, but I actually don't think we have a strategy anymore at all. I think it's just incoherent. I think that if you could catch 5 random generals involved in the prosecution of this war and put them in different parts of the room and ask each one, why are we in Afghanistan? You could conceivably get 5 different answers. So,
well, that's something I've always wondered, because we were there to topple the Taliban. We toppled the Taliban, and yet the Taliban continue to control major areas of the country. And even worse, Karzai has threatened to join the Taliban when he was trying to wring more concessions out of the United States. And he invited Mullah Omar to run for president of Afghanistan, which would be like inviting Martin Bormann to run for Chancellor of West Germany in 1946. And but nothing ever seems to stop the American government from this incredibly suicidal course. Recently it came out that bags of cash are being delivered to Karzai's office by the CIA, and that nobody knows where this money has gone. Nobody knows what it's been used for. And after it was revealed, the CIA immediately contacted Karzai and hastened to assure him that the bags would continue to arrive. Now, what on earth are they thinking?
Well, I'm thinking that in Afghanistan, that they'll allow us to be there until those bags of cash run out. That's what I think.
Of course.
I mean, it's not like they don't know that we're in a bottle, right? No, so I think the whole world knows that. I was at a conference a couple years ago, and I'll leave out the details of it, but it was a conference specifically at the behest of a certain DoD entity on coming to grips with the corruption in Afghanistan. And, I pointed out, and I almost got thrown out for it, because this was not what this conference was about. Of course it wasn't. I understood that, because that would have been to really be talking about the issue, which is, if you're going to say Karzai is corrupt, you would have to be able to show he's corrupt according to the Constitution of Afghanistan. The Constitution of Afghanistan is subordinated to Islamic law. So if you're going to argue that Karzai is corrupt based on the fact that he is misallocating our funds, you have to show that he did that according to Islamic law. And here's the point. it's by any means necessary part of that when non-Muslim forces enter Muslim lands that you must fight them by every means possible. That means if he wastes all the money we give him, even if it's to aggrandize himself, he's fulfilling a role because the money is not going for the purposes we've identified. So, of course, I pointed that out, and people kind of looked at me like, this is not being part of the team. You're here for this conference to come to a serious resolution of why there's corruption. And I thought, you're the ones who are giving money to people to build houses in Afghanistan who have no ability to build them correctly. And then you want to talk about putting a U.S. contractor or a contracting agent in the military and make them responsible because crap out becomes crap in, and you want to make someone responsible for it that you can punish, when in fact the problem is what if, the question I ask is, if Karzai is somewhat constrained by what he can do, what would he do to undermine us that he could get away with? And there's a part, don't get me wrong, I don't want anybody to say I'm saying Karzai's working with the Taliban or anything like that. I'm not. I'm just saying that it's one of those things that it would look a lot like this, I think. Keeping our
Absolutely.
people in abeyance, completely incapable. If they become capable, I mean, a couple months ago, I think it was, they told some of our spec ops people to move out of a region, noting, among other things, that they were being effective. So you look at that, you look at the rules of engagement that practically scream that an American has to be killed before you can return fire, and then maybe not always, to make it very clear that, I don't want my kid in that war.
Of course. I mean, what's the point? There's no definition of victory. There's no resolution in terms of defeating the Taliban. There's no idea of how the whole thing could end. It's just been given now this arbitrary date, which means that all that the people that were ostensibly fighting have to do is hold on until the arbitrary date passes, and then they've won. It's been a complete waste, a waste of billions of dollars, a waste of untold numbers of lives, and worst of all that are these green on blue attacks when our soldiers are murdered by the people that they are there to train and to help. It's really astonishing, and I believe that it all comes from the willful misunderstanding and refusal to acknowledge the reality of Islamic law and the teachings that Islamic law contains. You were talking about how all Karzai had to do to not be corrupt according to Islamic law was to make sure that that money was not used for the purposes we had intended it to be used. But also, just the fact that he's taking the money is a positive sign vis-a-vis Islamic law, because Islamic law mandates that the non-Muslims pay the Muslims, that they pay the jizya, the tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And Muslim scholars around the world, including in Norway, in Norway and in England recently, have said that it's the duty of the non-Muslim, the duty of the kuffar, to pay the Muslims. And so if Karzai is accepting bags of cash from the CIA, that's the duty of the CIA. That's the duty of the United States, to pay the Muslims. And so he's doing a meritorious thing by taking that money, using it for whatever.
So, well, using it for whatever, so long as it's not used for our purposes.
Precisely.
And now you'll get people coming, well, I was on this project and this really did well, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I got that. But what we're talking about is the grand swindling that is apparent to everybody. Sometimes I wonder, you watch these oversight hearings like in armed services, and they always have these people with a heck of a lot of brass behind them. And I sometimes wonder whether it's a trending left liberal member of Congress or whether it's a neocon on the right. How come you don't go up to those recently resigned captains who went to West Point, who were at the top of their game, and then got a really good job when they left, people who left, and why don't you bring them in? Why don't you bring in the 23-year-olds who come from, good families from all parts of the country and all strata of the country, who went in as enlisted and came out and they're completely disenchanted? Why? Why will you put total weight on what these people who are generals or admirals or secretaries, why are you giving them a full ride and not listening to any of these people? Because I think it's rather notorious that the junior officers are leaving, especially those who are in the middle deployed, with very clear a sense that things are not right, that the enlisted people are doing the same thing. Why not listen to them? Why not give it some weight? Because they're on the ground. And of course, what happens is this little, they don't have the big picture like we do. And I think that the whole world understands that the only people who don't have the picture are the decision makers who think they're the ones who only have the picture. So, my great concern is with this green on blue is it's building up. And I think that, I personally am greatly concerned with the idea that with the buildup of the green on blue and the escalation of these days of rage in furtherance of the OIC's implementing the 10-year plan, that 2 times the escalations came as part of an event in Afghanistan, one where there was a Quran burned in the United States, and one where there was a desecration of a Quran by a junior enlisted person burning copies of the Quran that were used to attack Americans for exercising their first, it was used to attack them for
exercising their First Amendment rights, just like in Benghazi.
The Constitution. So not only, I want to bring this back to the coin here, not only is the coin not going to work as it's been idealized in this current manifestation, but it's actually being used by the OIC through Karzai to level attacks on Americans for exercising their First Amendment rights inside the United States as the cost of this cooperation in Afghanistan. So, there's a sense in which the coin is used strategically as the whip to get us to subordinate our free speech rights in America to what Islamic law says we're allowed to say, according to the OIC's 10-year program, that you saw Karzai twice execute as a member state of the OIC. I forgot all about bringing that up about the coin. So it's not just that it's randomly bad over there, it's a malevolent influence here.
Is that also something that was responsible for, I believe it was General Petraeus and General Allen, both placing private phone calls to Terry Jones, trying to plead with him not to burn the Quran because of the consequences that could ensue in Afghanistan?
Well, I don't want to underestimate the risk it could put our troops at. However, I think the point is it was very public. And I think the message was, and this was the intended message, get our senior leaders to equate the subordination of the First Amendment here with cooperation there. And my only point is, if the general is going to knuckle under to that demand by setting in motion the trend of getting Americans to think that their First Amendment right of free speech needs to be conditioned upon what foreign entities demand in foreign countries. Well, I just lost track of my thought there. If that's what he wants us to do, then I think that there's something seriously wrong with us being there.
Absolutely.
Because that reflects the fact that they're defeated over there and they don't seem to know it. Because the very moment those threats got made to our troops, he should have been thinking that's why we're there in the first place, to go after people who think that way. And if we're not going to go after them, why are we there? So if it is true that he now, or our senior military envisions our military combat forces as being hostages to our First Amendment right exercise over here, then I think we're in the wrong place. And that's how ideological subversion works.
And when that's
So,
combined with the Obama administration's repeated, demonstrable hostility to the First Amendment, the fact that they signed on to Resolution 1618 of the UN Human Rights Council, calling for the criminalization of what was called incitement to religious hatred, which is really something that's very elastic in the eye of the beholder, and language that is manipulated and used by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to try to criminalize any analysis of the ways that the texts and teachings of Islam are used by Islamic jihadis in order to justify violence and terrorism and to recruit new terrorists. In light of all that, it seems as if it's very ominous that the Obama administration would be once again siding with the foes of free speech in Afghanistan, right?
well, they just raided AP's Associated Press's offices. I mean, I think that someone like Bush or someone like Reagan or someone like Nixon, he was run out of town, wasn't he? I think people don't understand the staggering breach of that, the staggering breach of someone's freedom that the IRS is being used to intimidate political organizations. But, I would not, there's one thing I would maybe differ with you on is this. I don't think 1618 is ambiguous. It's only ambiguous insofar as they replace the word Islam with religion at the UN. But if you take a look not at Resolution 1618 as passed, but all the drafts leading up to the final passage, the final version, they all explicitly stated that it came from the OIC. It was a product of the OIC, and that the defamation of religions is, as a practical matter at the United Nations, only understood as defamation of Islam. And I think everybody knows that.
Oh, I didn't mean to say it's ambiguous at all, Steve. It's very clear that it's only about Islam. Nobody ever cares, particularly Jews and Christians, about denigration of Judaism and Christianity. Jews and Christians are used to that and put up with it, understand that it is part of the price of living in a pluralistic society, and they're happy to pay that price because the alternative is to have the hegemony of one group over all the rest, and that's the road to tyranny. In any case, we have come to the midway point, and it is time to take a break. And so this is ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we have the great honor of having with us tonight Major Stephen Coughlin, and we will be right back after these important messages. Good evening and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer and we are here tonight with Major Stephen Coughlin. We are discussing the coin doctrine. And so once again, Steve, welcome back to the show. And one thing that I think that we could start off with in this second half of the program is we've been discussing what's wrong with the coin doctrine. And so could you sketch out for us what you think might be a more effective strategy in terms not just of Afghanistan, because I think it's pretty clear that the best strategy for Afghanistan would be to get out of there, but in general to deal with the jihad threat?
Well, let me just say I'm a retired major, but
it's kind of like President Carter, you know, you keep the title.
Carter, huh? Okay.
President Reagan.
Well, you know, I tell you, you ask a question and I think it's bundled up into a series of other questions. And as I've looked at the question you answer, can I kind of do a step back for a second and kind of walk back into it? You know, if you ever read a book written by a man named Edward Said called Orientalism, I think he wrote it in 78 or 79, okay, we can kind of realize that that's the point at which the Islamist narrative merged with the postmodern, the politically correct narrative, so that they became somewhat seamless. And in a sense, so that if you go too hard at CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, you will find the ACLU coming at you. Of course, if you're someone who's thrown into jail for exercising your First Amendment right by making a YouTube clip, you'll be thrown into jail and the ACLU will stay completely silent, as happened to the gentleman who made the YouTube clip that caused all the problems with allegedly, but completely spuriously, Benghazi. So I think that one of the things I find very much a part of the answer is, you know, it says, you know, Sun Tzu says you must know yourself and you must know the enemy. I think that we no longer know ourselves, we no longer know the enemy, and I think that we're watching our senior leadership. We're watching our senior leadership put people in power in the Middle East who our children will die defending against at some time in the near future. And it's easy to say Obama, but what about McCain? What about the people in our oversight committees who are rubber stamping it? What about George Bush? So I look at this and I see this as something across the board. What do you have to do to defend against jihad? You have to accept the fact that you have to defend and that you have to defend something. And, you know, I don't want to sound like a more theological about this than I am, but America stands for the principle, as enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, that we're a nation that was formed around the idea that there are rights endowed by the Creator. Now, keeping it, without getting into, too many theological ideas, the idea is man has rights that exist in man, inherent in man, that transcend the government and came before the government. And then we wrote a constitution to protect that understanding, and even went so far as creating the Bill of Rights. Yes.
I remember that thing.
The First Amendment.
People have mostly forgotten about it, but I do vaguely recall it, yes.
So what does the Constitution say? It says in Article 6, this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And what else does it say? You shall take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So I think that when we defend against jihad, we have to understand that our senior leaders took an oath when they understood what they were going to protect and defend, that they were going to protect and defend the Constitution. And those things that we just spoke of, or I just spoke of, that are inherent in the Constitution. This is important because the idea that you have rights endowed by the Creator stem in some measure in fact, in all measures, really, when you trace it all back, the idea that man was created in the image of God. And this is a concept that Islam categorically rejects. That's why they came up with the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, so that they could define human rights exclusively in terms of Islamic law, where they categorically rejected the Western, by which they meant Judeo-Christian concept of rights. So first of all, I think we really have to understand that to defend against jihad, we have to understand that our senior leaders are beholden to support and defend the Constitution, which is to support and defend a concept of rights that, as you noted, are being turned on their head by our current political leadership. You can say President Obama is doing this, and of course he is doing this, but it was President Bush who agreed with Musharraf back in 2006 that he would start looking at creating restrictions on free speech having to do with defaming Islam. So, it goes back that far. I think it was 2006. So I think what we have to do is start demanding that our senior leaders comply with the oath that they took, because the Constitution demanded it, because the Constitution, in doing this, in my mind, says strategic thinking starts here. It starts with defending this. And so those things that are against it, you defend against. So I think that one of the things that comes in is if you have people coming in saying that their goal is to implement Sharia law, where Sharia law defines itself, and the groups who are calling for it define it as the law of the land, that is by definition completely, what's the word? I am sorry, I'm just babbling
incompatible.
Here. That's exactly the word. It's completely incompatible. And all this babbling, all this wordsmithing will not ever change that. And so does that mean people who are Muslim can't come to this country and live? No, it doesn't mean that. Anybody who wants to come here and become a U.S. citizen and obey the laws of the United States should be allowed to be here. But we have to understand that the laws of the United States doesn't mean everything to everyone. It means what it says. So I think that as part of defending against jihad, we have to realize we have to defend who we are. And we are something, and we stand for something. And I find that when you scratch beneath the surface of some of our stalwart Republicans in leadership positions right now, they may not be as hostile as Obama on some of these issues. The total attack on the Second Amendment, the total attack on the First Amendment, a multi-tiered attack on the First Amendment. Their lack of fidelity and their lack of actual awareness of what that means, I find scary, because they think that patriotism is a talking point to get a certain demographic to vote for them. And if you actually challenge them, I think they kind of melt. That's not the answer you wanted, I'm sure, but it's kind of when I find myself scratching my head and say, how do we defend against jihad when we can't even defend who we are?
Well, no, I didn't want any particular answer. I'm just here searching for the truth along with you, Steve, and so I appreciate your answer, and I think it's absolutely true. But if you say that the first thing that we have to do, excuse me, is to defend the Constitution and make sure that our elected officials are doing that, well then, by our own discussion here tonight, we have already shown that the Obama administration isn't doing that and doesn't appear to be interested in doing that. Witness the signing on to Resolution 1618 that we discussed earlier that calls for the criminalization of defamation of Islam, which is clearly contrary to the First Amendment.
Well, absolutely, but and I agree with you on that. I think that the idea of signing on to something like 1618 with the idea of making it law is staggering. I don't remember the name of the case, but there's a case before the Supreme Court right now, totally unrelated to this, but it goes to the issue of whether you can, by treaty, overrule the Bill of Rights. And the very idea that this is in play is scary, because that means that they could by treaty come up with some, and it has nothing to do with 1618. Of course, the first couple cases won't, okay? They'll be kind of innocuous. But by treaty, you can overrule someone's constitutional rights. And I find it off-putting that that's even in play. And what concerns me so greatly, and I do understand that when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on July 15th, 2011, met in Istanbul, Turkey, with the head of the OIC and agreed to use America's best efforts to promulgate 1618, and she agreed that she would use peer pressure, old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming to go after American citizens for exercising their First Amendment rights. I just think that's staggering. Like, why are you saying this to a foreign leader in a foreign land? Especially when it runs totally contrary to the First Amendment. But what strikes me as much as that is the nothing sound you heard from our fearless leaders in the opposition in the Senate. In
That's
fact,
right.
every time I hear Obama do something I think is staggering in something like this, they line up McCain and who's the other guy?
Lindsey Graham?
Lindsey Graham. And they rubber stamp this stuff. And I mean, I am beside myself because you cannot square what is behind 1618 with fidelity to the First Amendment of the Constitution, which there's a sworn oath to support and defend. It is simply not possible. And and at some point, the American public has to demand that this sophistry stop. You
The
know,
problem
this,
is the American people are being lied to, and they don't even know that this kind of thing is going on. And so how
well,
can they demand that it stop?
the difference between being a citizen and being a subject is that
Yeah,
citizens have some requirement to keep themselves informed. And I think that, I mean, I don't want to blame the public because they are completely about this, because there is some level of deception. But I do think that we're looking at a generation going the 1980s forward, that we're educated in this postmodern narrative that completely overwrites really what rights are. How is the current administration? It's been moving forward for a long time, but how does the current administration define rights as something granted to you by the state? We, the state, have a right to take someone's work, a doctor, and give you free medicine because that's your right. The rights that the Constitution was created for was a right that could not, your having it didn't take anything away from anybody. And so this becomes very important in this discussion having to do with fighting jihad, because you have an American public who now thinks in terms of rights in terms of what the government will give them, which is a complete inversion, a 100% inversion of what the Constitution was ever intended to be when they talked about defending rights. And you know who else allocates rights? Islam does through Sharia law. So I'm not making any accusations that that's why we're doing it. I'm just saying that this statist idea of rights is what the Constitution was created to keep from happening. And while we're seeing that happening on one side, we're seeing the rise of a competing form of law that recognizes a completely different set of jurisdiction, a completely different jurisdictional understanding coming into play, leaving our public completely confused about that which they should not be confused.
absolutely, absolutely. And it seems to be deliberate. I mean, just recently in the regard to the Boston bombing, we saw that the excuse me, the FBI released the pictures of the Tsarnaev brothers without identifying them. They didn't know who they were at that time. And the Islamic Society of Boston knew who they were. They went there, and they said nothing. And just the other day, Lisa Wangsness, a reporter of the Boston Globe, wrote a glowing profile of the Imam Suhaib Webb, a convert to Islam, from the Islamic Society of Boston, saying nothing about that, never challenging him about not having cooperated, not having turned these guys in, or identifying them to authorities, but portraying him as this sweet, gentle guy and glossing over all the questionable aspects of his record. Now, she's just one example out of many, many hundreds I could give that the mainstream media seems to be intent on doing the same thing that the government's doing, denying, downplaying, ignoring this threat altogether. And so it makes things very difficult when the only place that you can come for the truth is to ABN and to places like this that we have a very small platform. And we can only hope that ultimately the truth will prevail by the simple power of the truth. On the other hand, totalitarian regimes have been able to enforce the big lie upon their people for decades at a time. And so at this point, I really don't know where it's going to go. Where do you see things going over the next few years, Steve?
Well, I think what you see, well, it's happened. I'll give you three events. One was the Fort Hood attack, followed by Benghazi, and now with this, is you see that after there's a flurry of revolt and some clear talking on the issue, you see the narrative starting to reimpose itself. So we should have expected a narrative to come out on how good Webb was. I find it interesting. When last we talked, we were talking about the Bishop of Worcester, Massachusetts, basically canceling you out. And then we find out that that same bishop, in response to the Boston bombing, came out and said that this, had to do with bullying, one of those politically correct buzzwords that has to do with conditioning children, and then went on and said that this was about kids playing too many computer games. I mean, what a departure from reality-based thinking. But you also had the Archbishop of Boston come out and say that these people don't represent Islam. And what's interesting is there you have it. Their interfaith outreach is the Islamic Society of Greater Worcester or the Islamic Society of Boston. The Islamic Society of Boston had as one of its founding trustees Yusuf al-Qawadari, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. You had the person who was its first president and the founder on the founding document, Abdul Rahman al-Amoudi, who is now in Supermax for being not just a Muslim Brotherhood operative, but an al-Qaeda operative. You have the same thing with the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Northern Virginia, where al-Awlaki was
Al-Awlaki, yes.
But going back to Boston,
Al-Awlaki.
Al-Awlaki, that's correct, was the imam. So we have these Islamic Society facilities run by people who we know have a background, and the Archbishop's response after the bombing is the religion's been hijacked. He's looking right at the face of players who are tier one bad guys. You go take a look at the founder, the first imam at the it goes by two names as far as I can tell. One is the Islamic Center of Worcester, and the other is the Islamic Society Greater Worcester. But its first imam was a man who became the imam in Columbus, Ohio, Sultan, who was kicked out of the country in 2008, or was not allowed to come back in the country in 2009 for things he said on Egyptian TV, calling for the killing of all Jews, and that the rocks themselves would know how to direct themselves at Jews and not, if they were thrown, and then said America would suffer a Holocaust. So that's the founding member there. And then in 2007, I believe, the imam who was there, and the name escapes me, was deported because, well, for many reasons, one of which is his brother is the founder of Lashkar-e-Taiba and was the person who was involved in the bombing in Mumbai. And it turned out that the Islamic Center or Islamic Society of New England, which was right down the road, that imam was also thrown out because he was the brother of the founder of Lashkar-e-Taiba. And it's like you look at who the bishop is coming to the aid of when the Islamic Society of Greater Worcester complained about you talking. We're talking about people who have known openly bad backgrounds.
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
like, buddy, do you do any due diligence? I mean, to the bishop. So, what do we do? Of course, we saw that. That's the narrative imposing itself. These articles coming out imposing themselves. I've actually been told, and I wanted to look into it, that there were some early articles that clearly associated Tsarnaev with the ISB, and at some of those, when they say originally written and then edited or something, that some of those articles are taking that language out.
Oh.
But he did belong to the MSA. Tsarnaev did belong to the MSA. He was a member of that church, and that church, the Islamic Society, Boston. Excuse me,
The mosque. He was
church,
a member of the mosque.
mosque, mosque. Well, remember, paragraph 17 of the explanatory memorandum, the Muslim Brotherhood strategy document from 1991, admitted into a federal court of law's evidence, basically said that these are not mosques, they're Islamic centers or Islamic societies.
Yes.
And what distinguished them from regular mosques is that they would be mosques like the time when Muhammad was settling in Medina. Okay? Well, when Muhammad was settling in Medina, remember the explanatory memorandum defines settling as jihad. So, the point is that these are not ordinary mosques by Muslim Brotherhood nomenclature. They're ones that are there to stage jihad, or that's what their own documents say. So, and this is who the bishop felt he had to yield to when he told a Catholic deacon that he could not go to a Catholic forum to talk to Catholic men. And he wants to know why some people might think he's in a state of submission. It's incredible.
Well, when Bishop Robert McManus of Worcester was arrested a week or so ago for drunk driving and leaving the scene of an accident, he admitted to a terrible error of judgment, which was kind of ironic since the next day he pleaded not guilty. So I don't know what his terrible error of judgment was. But in any case, I think probably he's had more than one terrible error of judgment. And his terrible error of judgment, unfortunately, is one that is shared by most of his clerical colleagues and most
Not
of
just Catholic.
the church establishment.
Yeah,
Yes?
absolutely. It's the USCCB, it's the rabbis, it's the ministers. It's
Absolutely.
and I, honest to God, I'm not, I don't want to beat up on the Archbishop. It's just that, computer games. I mean, when he said that, the picture was already unfolding about the fact that this was an overt act of jihad.
Yeah, it's
It was right
astonishing,
out.
the
It was
denial.
right
I mean, you wonder, do these guys really believe their own nonsense? Or
Well,
they just hope we do?
it'd be one thing if that sheep's clothing was like really tightly woven and believable, but I think that the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in New England, I think they make it they work hard to make that sheep's clothing threadbare and fraying so that you have to force yourself to say, I see sheep. I see sheep. 1 + 1 = 42.5. And I think they force these people to go into a fundamental act of denial, because at some point when people say, well, you lied to me, you tricked me, they're going to say, really? I
Yeah.
mean,
It was up front all along. You just
it was
didn't
up
want to
front
notice.
all along. You had
Yeah.
to drink the Kool-Aid. And we said Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid.
Yes.
So anyhow, I don't want to beat up on the bishop, but there are people dying. There are people who died in Boston. And you take a look at Inspire magazine. Do you know what the name of the most recent Inspire magazine was called as an honorary a copy?
No, what was the title?
It was called The Lone Mujahid's Handbook, meaning the individual jihadi's handbook.
Oh, there we
And
go.
which means individual jihad, okay, which our government wants to call lone wolf jihad, because they can't get them lone wolf terrorism, because they don't want to basically be showing that Al-Qaeda has been saying that their strategy, going all the way back to 2010, their strategy was forms of terrorism exactly like what you saw, okay, right down to the fact that they called for pressure cooker bombs. I mean, when I
Absolutely.
saw a pressure cooker bomb, boom, we knew what that was, and we just had to wait for the facts to come forward.
And then just days ago, a Saudi national with an altered passport was arrested at the Detroit Metro Airport with a pressure cooker in his luggage. And they were asking him, why are you bringing a pressure cooker into the United States? He said, oh, because you can't buy them here. And they said, of course you can buy pressure cookers in the United States. And he said, oh, well, it's because my nephew bought one, but it was cheap, so I wanted to bring him a better one. And, it was rather transparent. And then again, in other news, just recently, of course, I don't know when exactly this will air, but recently at the time of this taping, we had 7 Muslims arrested after midnight at a large public water supply reservoir outside Boston. And
I
so
heard
once
about that.
again, how's that interfaith outreach working for you, Bishop? Because it seems to be that the jihad in Boston is continuing and ongoing.
Well,
Uh,
did they find them having, were they casing it, or did they have material with them that?
they said that they were students and that they were there on an educational project. Why they were working on a field trip out after midnight was not explained.
Well,
Seems to me to be a rather transparent and flimsy justification for being there.
it
In
is
any case,
interesting.
we're almost out of time. Stephen Coughlin, Major Stephen Coughlin, it's been, and you keep the title like President Carter. It's been very great to have you with us again, and I thank you for coming to the show again on some short notice. This has been ABN's Jihad Watch program, and we've been discussing the COIN doctrine, that is the official counterintelligence strategy of the United States government, particularly in regard to Afghanistan, and larger issues of why the general approach to counterterror is so drastically flawed. And I thank you very much for your insights. This is ABN's Jihad Watch program, and I am Robert Spencer. Thank you for watching. Good night, and God bless.
Take care.